Today I wanted to talk about Icarus Uprising because, quite frankly,
It's been too long.
since I've really heard any real recognition of this game, it's justifiable because we haven't heard any news of a port or a sequel. But for me, I think it's the best comeback game from a seemingly dead franchise ever. I don't know that many franchises, so if someone deserves that title over Uprising, be sure to let me know down below. Because the only other franchise I could really think of was Donkey Kong with Country Returns. That was like a 15-year gap. It seems like we're gonna have to wait another 15 years for another installment. At least they ported Tropical Freeze to Switch. That bought them some time and money. But Kid Icarus, there was 21 years in between games, and it's not like the developers could just pick up from where the series was left off, as in one of the I Wanna Asks interviews, Sakurai explains how there were only really two things established: Pit, an angel who couldn't fly, and his companion Palutena. So it was an extraordinary effort to completely revise and rework a story that would fit modern audiences who likely didn't know anything about the franchise and definitely hadn't played the originals. And if you had played the originals, the game does an excellent job in making you think this is just a remodeling of the originals, as 5 of the first 8 bosses are all original enemies, and the final objective was to take down Medusa, until
Now wait just a second.
Huh? Did you hear something?
I said wait just a second.
You're got to be hearing things.
Hades, the true villain behind it all, who has just been waiting in the shadows for his time to come. And during that time, he's constructed a pretty menacing plan, using the dead and unrested souls as his seemingly never-ending military. And it was funny replaying Chapter 6, where I didn't realize beforehand, but they literally foreshadow Hades, as Palutena notices the amount of underworld troops doesn't really make any sense, and notes that there's something unusual about their souls. But in the end, she just reaffirms that it's all Medusa's doing. So there was really no way to predict Hades' surprise entrance, and to this day I still have a faint memory of him pulling down the credits. It's for sure one of the highlights of this game. In my opinion, Hades is a very well balanced villain. He obviously doesn't take anything too seriously, but even throughout his joking and randomly antagonizing someone, it can be anyone, even his own men, he still doesn't really lose his scariness or formidability. I think in part because he is so distant, you don't really have any direct contact with him until the very end of the game. It's just sometimes when you have such a jokey, mad villain, they can start to seem a bit too insignificant and look a bit stupid because of it. Take Dr. Eggman for example. Now, he's a whole different case because he's been in damn near every Sonic game and all throughout their media, but he's just an example of where a game can teeter that jokey, comedic value and the villain's prestige is diminished because of it. But I never found that in Hades' case. It's not that common that you even hear one villain like Hades openly talking in a conversation. I mean, we only really got to hear Bowser's voice in the Mario movie, and Ganondorf, like when people heard his voice in the recent trailers, they were like, never heard this voice, is this his actual voice, what he actually sounds like? But Kid Icarus, there's a whole 20 bosses involved in conversation. Some are so third worldly and bizarre that they're unable to speak, but the ones who can just have this uncanny amount of confidence and swagger that is just so authentically delivered. And the dialogue in this game is very fun and charming. It adds a lot of depth and joy to these characters and really breadth to the game. It's very random and sporadic. It still does a good job of explaining the situation to newcomers at the start of the game and previews the objective in the fly section. The dialogue takes place while you're actually playing the game, which I must admit I was originally going to mark that down as a critique because it can get quite hard to follow while you're slashing down like a million enemies, but playing it more and more, I think I've realized it has some undeniable benefits. First of all, it means the dialogue is actually in sync with the gameplay, which, thinking about it, it makes the most sense for games, and especially Uprising. Like, what would suddenly falling down feel like without Palutena preparing you, and Pits
What? Chicken is much more economical!
walking into the chamber where you're expecting a prize, but Hedra's heads just fall down? Or how about taking down Varini's precious nature army? Like, you wouldn't feel anything if it wasn't for Varini's raging while it's actually happening. Second benefit for having dialogue is it's a bit of an insurance if players do get a bit bored and repetitive with the gameplay. It's good to have something amusing going on. So overall, comparing it to other games that receive a ton of criticism about just having a slog of text afterwards or cutscenes that take forever to explain things, I think Uprising struck upon a really good alternative that rises above the rest in many ways and is definitely unique. I definitely haven't seen a game rise to the heights of Uprising with the amount of jokes breaking the fourth wall, which I loved any time they did that. It just amazed me how many internal jokes they were able to make as well. Like recently it's been the Pit, Hades, Pit, but also the Pitu and Pity Pad and a lot more. It's just the type of stuff that sticks with you and stays with the people who've played the game. My favorite characters were probably the space pirate ship guy and some of the other lunatics like Hedra and Pyron and the old guy who manages the trials for the 3 new sacred treasures, and of course the mainstay 5, Vridi, Hades, Dark Pit, Palutena and Pit. And it's not just the boss's dialogue that is unique, the boss battles themselves are pretty unique too. I may just appreciate them more after playing some, let's say, repetitive gameplay, but to show the difference I'll highlight stages 5 to 8, where you go from Pandora, who sinks into the ground to lay off a variety of attacks, to Dark Pit, who moves just like you, so you have to counter yourself and be really agile, to Phantos, who, contrary to Pandora, can levitate and shows all sorts of disguises and shape-shifting abilities to confuse you. Then you have the Purple Gentleman, who blinds the surrounding area to strike you from any angle. And that's only 4 to show an example. There were many more creative designs and surprises, like Hades' Heart, which I still have no idea what the goal was here. And yeah, to be honest, a lot of the time I was pretty battered before I even got to a boss, so the initial intensity was dropped down and I found the bosses over quicker than I anticipated, which is a credit to my inability, but also a credit to the general enemies, because there were so many unusual monsters who were such a nuisance to face, and utilized the 3D space really well, whether it was the bean throwing guy, the spinning turtle, the tank, the enemy that goes up and down. There was just such a variety, which means you have to legitimately think your way through situations, rather than just mashing buttons to victory. I'm talking about the land battles. The air battles are a little bit simpler. You can mostly just circle around like the game advises. That's not to say they didn't vary it up a little bit with confusing enemies that don't do damage unless you hit them, like the poison cloud enemy or the fire skulls. And there are many different hazards that you have to dodge depending on the environment. And that's probably my favorite part of the air battles, on top of the dialogue of course. It's just the amount of environments that we got to explore. One time you're flying through normal Earth, the next on a pirate ship in space, then in Pandora's confusing lab, and the next in the Aurum facility. And it's not just the environments that change, there are a lot of smaller enjoyable plots that balance out the overall mission of taking down Hades. And all of these smaller missions make differences to the gameplay. When Palutena is possessed, you are partnered with Vridi, and at least one of the times you have the ability to fly more. Or sometimes you're on a grind rails, or inside the transformer, or even a dog. I just really think for longer running linear games, it's necessary to mix up the environments and reflect the changes in the gameplay. And with Uprising, you can really tell there's no disconnect between gameplay story, and dialogue. The reason for that we'll get to later, but first I wanted to wrap up the story. Hopefully I've clarified this video is full of spoilers, but I wanted to highlight probably the greatest example of stage variety with the final battle against Big Bad Hades. It has everything. First he appears from the ground like a mole, very underworld of him, and then he just starts madly chasing you, and then you fly by him and see his actual moles. We won't spend too much time on this. There was also the Wii Sports Resort trying to match the wobbly circle, and then you have to resist the cursor going outwards, which really confused me at first. It was also funny and pretty unsettling when they brought back Medusa for the final time. For some reason the whole puppet master relationship hadn't fully sunk in, and this was the biggest visual representation they could have done to show that. Medusa just getting so fed up with being reborn, and honestly it puts perspective on the originals, knowing that there was this big mega boss behind it all, and Medusa was just a mere puppet for his plan. Anyway, probably my favorite part of the stage was the very end, when he's doing the eye beams, and meanwhile you're charging the ultimate weapon, so as he hits you the weapon's charge decreases, so there's this build up, and it's really cool how at last it's just you and him, face to face, no shadow for him to hide behind, no commander for him to call upon. It is time for Hades to face the wrath of the light.
It's hard to believe, but you actually got me, Pit. The nerve of you.
And man, was this a really dignifying moment. It was kind of bittersweet a few minutes later, realizing the game is actually over, but it was still super satisfying, and it did really feel like we were building up to the final showdown, with Hades' commanders decimated and Vrede and Dark Pit on our side. There was not much chance of Hades stopping us. I did love the end when it cuts to Pit and you're expecting by his expression a more serious and potentially sympathetic side of him, which would be pretty cliche response, but instead he just does the victory pose, which is just so Pit and favorite Nintendo character. This may sound weird, but he was before I even played Uprising, back in the day of Super Smash Bros. Brawl, which is too long ago. For whatever reason he just became my character, or my main as they call it. At that stage I had very little knowledge of any of these Nintendo characters aside from the obvious ones, but I couldn't tell you anything about Olimar or Samus, and definitely not Pit. But it's been fun discovering each of their unique gameplay and series, even if I've yet to really attach to any of them quite like my first loves. But Pit I just gravitated to in that game. He's always just been such a bright, fun, competitive character, and I'm glad I got to finally see what his world was about. And as I open up with, I just don't hear this game discussed, and it is unlikely we're going to see a sequel for quite some time, longer than Donkey Kong fans probably, but I don't think that should take away from Uprising, the game that was. I've gone long enough without mentioning the people who developed this game, Sora, which if you didn't know is led by Sakurai. I mentioned earlier how there wasn't any noticeable disconnects between dialogue, story, and gameplay, and that was largely because Sakurai took on the responsibility to write the whole script. He did this because he had noticed in previous games there was this disconnect between story and dialogue, so he just decided to write the whole thing and ensure that there wouldn't be any, and make sure it synced in with the music and the story, and really made sure everything was in sync. And Sakurai has been quoted multiple times in his displeasure of expectations of sequels. He believes sequels are now at an unnatural level. in another interview, he stated it's really unlikely he would be the one to lead development on an Uprising sequel, going on to say maybe in another 25 years someone would pick it up again. And as much as I did love Uprising, being realistic, it is highly unlikely we'll see a sequel anytime soon, given Project Zero has since disbanded and Sakurai has made it clear he's more interested in advising and being a helping hand to upcoming video game designers than making games at them. But as the interviewee did note, there has been an expansive world created, but in all honesty, there isn't an obvious next step in the story, with Hades and his commanders taken down. So it will probably take someone with a fresh set of eyes to continue the story. So I think there is a beauty in stopping at one game. I mean, I would kind of argue Kid Icarus has like a whole 26 episodes of content already, and many different stories intertwined, and as we know, Sakurai doesn't usually plan for sequels. He puts everything into one game, and given we got a lot of content in the first one, I'm more than satisfied with that decision, and I think it's more than respectable. As we know, many franchises get pretty stuck trying to re-innovate and sell off the same product, and you know, the fan base can be disappointed because it's just more of the same, or there isn't a very, well, we know history with sequels pretty much, they're not usually well loved. And I mean, that's to say there even was a decision, because I've heard Uprising didn't sell as well as expected, and by the time Uprising came out anyway, the bells for a new Smash game started ringing, so there's just not much chance of a sequel. Something a little bit more likely is a port to the Switch, which could remodel it in HD goodness if someone can be bothered doing that. I think I would still honestly prefer it on the 3DS. I'm assuming the Switch you would have to use a second analog stick as the aim, which I still think it functions better with the touchscreen. It feels more intuitive and quicker, but the Switch may fix the uncomfortable control scheme that many people struggled with, so that would be a big positive if it were to join the Switch's massive library, that more people can actually play it. I mean, I've heard a lot of left-handers really struggling with the controls, so that would be a big positive. But on the topic of a sequel, it's not like Uprising left us nothing to do. Like I said, I feel like there was a whole 26 episodes, but I mean, on top of the main story, there's an online feature that functions really well. Like, the servers are pretty good, and I think it would be a lot of fun if you had a group of friends, or if it was still like 2013. I didn't give it a try in each of the modes, but yeah, I think it would probably work best if you had like a group of friends playing. There was also a 3D gallery for models and items in the game, which is linked to the idle toss feature, very reminiscent of Smash 2. Another feature that I've been having a lot of fun with recently is fusing weapons. It's something I didn't do in the main playthrough. I usually just picked the strongest weapon and just kind of stuck with it. But as I've gone back and replayed a few of the stages, I've made an effort to switch between the weapons and see which ones work for me. And regarding the main story itself, there's still a decent amount of fun to be had. If you're like me, you forget a ton of the story details, so it doesn't get too repetitive going back. The main attraction is trying to conquer the game on higher difficulties, because I mean, at least for me, in my first playthrough, like, the intensities is not all that impressive. Personally, I'm also very tempted to try and finish the puzzles. That's a goal that I'll work away at slowly, but I definitely feel like there's still some value in the main story replayability. I touched on the controls before, and I think that's the overriding critique of this game, maybe along with the graphics, but I would argue they're pretty good. I played it on the 2DS, which I think is logically more comfortable. I've heard it's more ergonomic. I mispronounced that word probably, but I've heard a lot of 3DS users have had to put it on a stand to play. I think they packed that in with Yeah, personally, I didn't really have too much trouble with the controls. I mean, if I do play it like lying down or play it at one time for more than 1 or 2 levels, I didn't really do that often. But your hands will get pretty sore and ruined. So whenever it does tell me to take a break, I listen and pack it up. But yeah, that pretty much concludes my Uprising commemorative video. Throughout the video, I was just trying to highlight all of the different aspects and show how in combination this game is just simply incredible. And I find it really hard to criticize when, first of all, I haven't really seen any other game like Uprising. It's super unique between its dialogue, the villains. I read on the wiki pages that Sakurai aimed to stray away from the simple good versus evil storyline, rather using the Greek mythology to create many powers. For example, the Nature Army, the Underworld, Dark Pit even, like the Orums, even the Lightning Chariot, who all come into conflict due to their clashing views and just create this escalating level of chaos for the player to experience. And there have been some interesting discussions of who is actually good in this game. So that's just another example of creative and thoughtful game design that I haven't really seen anyone else do. But you can really tell the game cuts no corners. It has so much love and care from a team who literally didn't have any investment to the franchise beforehand. Like, there is such a good balance between paying homage to the originals and the already existing stuff, while just completely overhauling the world and creating something of their own. Like, you still hear some of the retro 8-bit sounds and encounter majority of the original enemies, probably all of them. Like, a decent amount of the enemies are original. Also, just reading from a wiki page, the aim of the originals is to retrieve the 3 sacred treasures, which is exactly how you close out the game. So it's paying respect in that way. And I also liked how they slowly unveiled the general enemies. Like, it started off with the simple original ones, and then it builds into this huge roster of enemies. And I mean, it's the same system for the weapons too. You're only introduced to the first blade, and then you slowly build up throughout the story to have an abundance of different options to further individualize your own experience. So yeah, thank you for watching. Like I said, Icarus Uprising is just a whole lot of fun. And like I said, it's like 26 episodes of just pure fun. And if you haven't already, I would highly suggest playing the game. You can get it at the 3DS. No, I've heard the game is pretty expensive these days, so hopefully you can find a way to get it somehow. The eShop just doesn't allow that. I will add links in the description if you're interested in hearing more of the story behind the development, because it is pretty interesting. Obviously, Sakurai has only really worked on Smash for Nintendo, aside from Kirby, of course, but there's a pretty interesting backstory to the decision behind it, so I'll leave all the links and information down below. But yeah, thank you for watching,